So let me tell you a little bit about how Saunders makes this case. First thing he says is, well, in order to use this cognitive mechanism that we have sketched to rationally justify a norm, the first thing you've got to do is generate a lot of judgments about actual and hypothetical cases in a given moral domain. And by the way, the philosophers, of course, are going to recognize this as a very, very common process in philosophical reflection on morality. Indeed, back in the days 10 or 12 years ago when I every year used to teach applied moral issues, this is what we did in the introductory applied moral issues classroom. Right? So the idea is you consider a whole bunch of cases and let the system just make judgments about it. Okay, so you've now got a whole bunch of cases, and we'll talk about some of these again in the last lecture. Things, think of them if you want as trolley cases, if that means anything to you, or cases about abortion, or cases about euthanasia, things of that sort. All right. Well, what do you do next? The next thing you do is you articulate a moral principle or a set of principles where the goal is to capture these cases. That is to say, to entail that these cases, given the surrounding facts, will come out judged the way you've just judged them. And as Rawls, of course, notes when he talks about reflective equilibrium, that will often require ignoring one or more of the judgments. It's often impossible to get a coherent, simple, satisfying principle or set of principles that'll capture all those judgments. And furthermore, the process is one that requires very explicit and often painstaking reasoning, as we all know when we engage in this sort of thing in doing philosophy. So mostly because I found it fun to play with the PowerPoint. Here's what that one looks like. All right. Try to get a principle. When you get a principle, you're often going to have to get rid of one of the judgments. Third step. Well, the deliberative agent, now that he or she has formed a principle, makes an explicit commitment, thinks to himself, this is a good principle. I ought to behave in accordance with what this principle requires. Whoops. And that can be thought of. It's not entirely clear how to conceptualize a commitment in this model, but that can be thought of as forming the belief, an explicit belief that one ought to behave in accordance with the principle. So the principle then gets moved up there. And finally, now that you've got this belief, how do you act on it? Well, I think this is the cleverest part of Leland Saunders' article. He says, look, often when you're in that situation, you have a belief that you ought to act on a principle, but it's not a principle in your biologically given norm system. Not what's in the norm system isn't biologically given. The box is biologically given, but it hasn't gotten in there yet. So it's not a, he thinks of this in system 1 and system 2 terms. It's a system 2 entity. It hasn't made it into the system 1 part of the mind yet. Well, what do you have to do when you're trying to stick with a principle that you are explicitly committed to? Well, you often have to explicitly rehearse the principle. Here's what I should do whenever the situation arises. You say to yourself, I ought or ought not to do A. And what's clever, I think, about Saunders' argument is that he points out there's a fair amount of literature suggesting that one of the environmental cues that leads to norm acquisition is the linguistic cue. Being told explicitly, you ought to do this. It's not the only one. But there's a fair amount of evidence that that explicit repetition of a norm, in fact, is one of the things that gets stuff from the environment into the norm box in the Swapada and Stich mechanism. So sometimes, at least, after repeated articulation of the norm does, in fact, get, or the principle doesn't get, in fact, get internalized. So the idea is this. Explicit verbal rehearsal, and that triggers the acquisition mechanism, and you get something in there. All right. Well, now where are we? He says, look, once you're in that situation, you've got that principle which is rationally supported now, if you think the Rawlsian system is rationally supported. and it will have the capacity to motivate behavior the way the system 1 norm system motivates behavior. So what you'll have is behavior motivated by the norm system, but driven by a principle which is itself rationally generated. So this is the last part of the story. That principle ends up driving judgments, and mostly because I thought I need a glass of water at this point, I've got a slide that says, well, as Saunders points out, this is a very complicated and arduous process, so it's likely to be relatively rare. Indeed, it may well be that, for the most part, only philosophers or people heavily influenced by philosophical training engage in this sort of process. Why is it hard and arduous? Well, here's where I get my water. It worked. Good. Okay, but last thing to point out is, as Saunders does not point out, if you start with deliberative agents, so philosophers, if you want, who are going to engage in this kind of psychologized reflective equilibrium, and if they start with socially acquired norms, things that were in their norm box, as we call it, long before they got into the philosophy class or came upon this method on their own, they start with different socially acquired norms, they're likely to end up with different judgment capturing principles, and therefore with different rationally generated norms. So although we've got rationality in this Rapata and Stich picture, these people will be rational Rawlsian agents who nonetheless have fundamental moral disagreement. And that's it.